The novels of Nobel Prize-winning author William Faulkner are consistently ranked amongst the greatest and most influential works in world literature. As a writer, he constantly experimented with new structures and stylistic devices, and he is justly famous for the range and depth of his characterization and portrayals of complex and uncomfortable social issues. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the life of one of America's greatest writers, William Faulkner. A man who produced 19 novels, dozens of short stories, collections of poetry, and public letters, but an intensely private man who rarely smiled. I wanted to find out from my perspective as a psychiatrist why a man who achieved so much in his lifetime appeared to be so troubled. William Faulkner was born in 1897 in New Albany, Mississippi. His father, Murray Faulkner, spelt without a U, worked for the family railroad business, and his mother, Maud Butler, was a keen amateur painter. They lived in Ripley, Mississippi for a few years, but when William was 5, the family moved to Oxford, the county seat of Lafayette County, then a small town of less than 2,000 souls. It was an area that was still dependent on cotton, with several large plantations, but also swathes of thick forest and swampland, and Mississippi's oldest university, Ole Miss. His family, although established and reasonably affluent, was not quite part of the old cotton aristocracy of the South. His great-grandfather, though, William Clark Faulkner, was a local legend. He served in the Mississippi Volunteers in the Mexican-American War, and later raised a company of men and was made a colonel in the Confederate Army in the Civil War. He was a lawyer who founded several businesses, including a railroad company. And he was a successful writer of poetry, at least one play, and several novels, including The White Rose of Memphis, a murder mystery set on board a steamboat, which ran to several editions and sold over 160,000 copies. The Old Colonel, as he was known, died in dramatic circumstances in 1889, just 8 years before William's birth, when he was shot by a former business partner with a grudge, dying of his wounds the following day. The stories, and there were lots of them, about his great-grandfather's exploits were a source of fascination and inspiration for the young Faulkner, who at a young age declared, "I want to be a writer just like my great-granddaddy." And the Old Colonel was the model for his character Colonel John Sartoris, who appears in 2 of his novels, several short stories, and is one of the cornerstones of Faulkner's fictional Yoknapatawpha County, a Chickasaw Indian word. His grandfather, too, was a successful lawyer and businessman, but when he abruptly sold the family railroad, William's father felt his birthright had been violated, and he moved his wife and sons to Oxford, Mississippi, where he tried to set up a livery stable and hardware store, before becoming the business manager at the University of Mississippi, and descending into bitter alcoholism. Although comfortable enough, the Faulkner family home was not a happy one. His father's long silences, strict discipline, and heavy drinking led to erratic behaviour at times, and he would disappear for periods of time to the local Keeley Institute to dry out. His mother, a shy, insecure woman who hid her wariness of strangers under a mask of brusqueness, did her best to compensate for her husband's lack of warmth to his sons, especially his disappointingly diminutive firstborn. The family hired an African-American live-in nanny, Caroline Barr, to help raise Billy and his 3 younger brothers. Mammy Callie, as they called her, was born into slavery and told countless stories about her experiences that helped shape Faulkner's fictional world. He had a deep affection for her, later describing her as someone who gave to my family a fidelity without recompense, and to my childhood an immeasurable devotion and love. From an early age, Faulkner had a fondness for storytelling. One of his cousins noted, "It got so that when Billy told you something, you never knew if it was the truth or just something he'd made up." At school, he started well, skipping the 2nd grade and showing an aptitude for art and literature. He read voraciously, immersing himself in classic literature and poetry. But his bookishness, small stature, and the back brace his mother made him wear to improve his posture made him the object of teasing by his peers, and he gradually lost interest in classes and began bunking off. As a young boy, he was very close to his mother, who doted on him, but after the birth of his youngest brother Dean when he was 10, he felt frozen out and transferred his affections to his best friend, unusually for the time a girl, Estelle Oldham, 7 months older, with whom he shared a close bond. So close that Estelle told her nanny that she would one day marry Billy Faulkner. The older he got, the more he read, and the more he read, the more different he felt from everyone around him. His father had no interest in literature, and there was no one he could talk to about his passion. Until he met the ebullient Phil Stone, a student at the University of Mississippi, 4 years his senior, and from one of Oxford's oldest families. Stone was an aspiring poet himself, and they discussed everything from romantic poetry to Civil War history and Mississippi politics. And Stone took it upon himself to teach him the stuff his father hadn't, which included a trip to Memphis to experience the nightlife. Faulkner felt that this informal education was all he really needed, so in 1915, after 11th grade, he dropped out of high school and took a job as a bookkeeper at his grandfather's bank. Faulkner showed his youthful poetry to Stone, who was impressed, but he also began experimenting with alcohol at this time, developing a fondness for whiskey that soon became a problem that would remain with him for the rest of his life. When he wasn't at the bank, he spent most of his time carousing with a town drunk, who had a reputation for peeing on lampposts, and he began to develop a reputation of his own. And it had nothing to do with literature. But he continued reading widely and writing poetry. His earliest literary efforts were consciously modelled on Scottish poets Robert Burns and James Thomson, and the Shropshire Lad Cycle by A.E. Housman, whose pessimism and preoccupation with early death appealed to the lost generation who had witnessed the carnage of World War I. He also continued hanging out with Estelle, who was now taking classes at the university, until his world was turned upside down by hearing that her parents had arranged for her to marry Cornell Franklin, a tall, handsome Ole Miss graduate, a major in the National Guard, and Assistant Attorney General in Hawaii. A far more solid marriage prospect than the young Billy Faulkner, social misfit, high school dropout, and budding alcoholic. Faulkner had long assumed that he and Estelle would marry one day, and the news sent him into a spiral of depression and heavy drinking. Estelle wasn't particularly happy either, crying all night before her wedding and telling her mother she wasn't sure. But in April 1918, she and Franklin were married, and she disappeared off with him to Hawaii. Devastated, the 20-year-old Faulkner had to leave town, and when Phil Stone invited him to Yale, he readily accepted. Through Stone, Faulkner met writers Robert Frost and Ezra Pound, and he continued writing poetry. But he needed money, and he took a job at the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, wanting to do his bit for the war effort. He also hatched a plan to sign up for the British Armed Forces, and in June 1918, after weeks of practicing an English accent with Stone and changing the spelling of his name to Faulkner with a U, he went to the British recruiting office in New York City and signed up for the newly established Royal Air Force. Part of the Faulkner mythology is that he tried to enlist in the US Army, but was rejected for being underweight and for his short stature of 5'5". But there are no records to support this, and there was no minimum height requirement at the time. So it was probably just another one of his tall stories. His letters actually reveal that he did not want to become a private soldier and get sent as cannon fodder to the Western Front. And this was the reason he went to Canada to train as an officer cadet in the Royal Air Force. Although he began training in Toronto, before he could finish ground school or even get into a plane, the war ended. Despite his lack of combat experience, however, Faulkner returned to Oxford claiming he had served heroically and fabricated stories about his exploits and claimed to have received head and leg injuries, and for a while he walked with a fake limp and wore the uniform of a rank he never attained. Was he trying to match the glorious military history of his great-grandfather? Or maybe just trying to get some attention from the young ladies of Oxford? In early 1919, he decided to try his luck in New Orleans, then a significant literary centre, hoping for artistic inspiration and spending his days writing and his nights drinking. His efforts paid off, and the New Republic agreed to publish one of his poems, L'après-midi d'un faune, inspired by his love for Estelle, paying him $15, his first earnings as a writer. In the summer of 1919, the University of Mississippi announced that it would admit returning war veterans regardless of their previous educational experience, so Faulkner decided to return to Oxford to enroll. When the Mississippian published his short story, Landing in Luck, it convinced him that he should stick to his dream of becoming a writer. However, his overconfidence, taste for tweeds, and his affected English accent didn't win him too many friends. Dubbed the Count, his classmates made fun of him, and his writing was parodied in the student magazine. Academically, he didn't excel, getting a D in English. So, convinced that formal education was pointless, he dropped out after less than 3 semesters in November 1920. He continued to work on his writing, however, and produced a collection of love poems, Vision in Spring, for Estelle. And even though she was now married, he presented her with a bound copy when she was visiting her hometown. But feeling stifled by life in Oxford, Faulkner moved to New York City in the autumn of 1921. He found a job as a bookstore clerk and adopted a bohemian lifestyle, mixing with other aspiring writers and artists and drinking every night to the point of passing out in his Greenwich Village room. After just a few months, he was fired from his job, and at the urging of his mother, he returned to Oxford. He briefly worked as a carpenter, and then landed the perfect job as the postmaster at the university, which he managed to keep going for 2 years, despite willfully neglecting his duties and spending all his time writing. When he was finally fired, he told the postal inspector, "I reckon I'll be at the beck and call of folks with money all my life. But thank God I won't ever again have to be at the beck and call of every son of a bitch who's got 2 cents to buy a stamp." He continued sending off poems and short stories, but received rejection after rejection. In 1922, his poem Portrait was published in the New Orleans literary magazine Double Dealer, but then nothing. Phil Stone continued to believe in his talent, however, and in 1924 he asked the small press 4 Seas Company in Boston if they would publish a collection of Faulkner's poems if he covered the costs. They agreed to publish 1,000 copies of The Marble Faun for $400, around $8,000 today. 19 poems about fauns, nymphs, shepherds and shepherdesses, mostly written 5 years earlier and reworked into a tighter collection. The critics felt they showed promise, but had long stretches of creditable but not remarkable verse. At the age of 27, he returned to New Orleans, where he became part of a vibrant literary community, mingling with writers and artists, including Sherwood Anderson, who had just published the best-selling Dark Laughter, which dealt with the new sexual freedoms of the 1920s, and was heavily influenced by James Joyce's Ulysses. The 2 men hit it off immediately. Faulkner stayed with Anderson and his wife for a while, and it was Anderson who encouraged Faulkner to concentrate on fiction. So he began work on his first novel, Soldier's Pay. A technically ambitious depiction of the sense of alienation experienced by soldiers returning from the war to a civilian world they no longer seem to be part of. It received mixed reviews. There was praise for its exploration of the psychological impact of war, but criticism of its formulaic plot and stereotypical characters. Many reviewers commented on the echoes of 19th century poetry in the book and the imitativeness of his style, and it did not sell well, especially when compared to the other debut novel of a lost generation author that came out the same year, Ernest Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. Although he continued to drink heavily in New Orleans, he would get up at 7 o'clock each morning to begin writing, and was so absorbed in this he lost touch with his old friend Phil Stone, who sent him a telegram. "What's the matter? Do you have a mistress?" To which Faulkner replied, "Yes, and she's 3,000 words long." But he had met someone, Helen Baird. He fell in love and wrote her poems. He even dedicated his novel to her. But when he proposed marriage, she politely declined. After 6 months in the Big Easy, he set off for Europe with $70 in his pocket and high hopes of finding greater appreciation of his work in England, as had been the case for T.S. Eliot before him. But he soon moved to Paris, where he grew a beard and began work on his second novel, Mosquitoes, a satirical depiction of the free-living New Orleans literary scene that was none too complimentary about identifiable individuals, including Sherwood Anderson. The story follows a diverse cast of archetypes as they embark on a 4-day trip on a motorised yacht, owned by a wealthy patron of the arts. Confined to the boat, the characters explore a variety of sexual relationships and question traditional gender roles. The book contained many passages that were too explicit for the time, which had to be edited out prior to publication, interrupting the narrative flow, and it was poorly reviewed and did not sell well, and most scholars continue to regard it as one of his weakest novels. Even though Paris at the time was the melting pot for artistic endeavours of every kind, drawing avant-garde creatives from across Europe, America and Russia with the lure of cheap rents, cheap booze and a no-questions-asked attitude to sex, Faulkner did not really mix with this scene, isolating himself in his room and focusing on his novel. After returning to Oxford, Faulkner started working on his next novel, Flags in the Dust, setting it in Yoknapatawpha County, a county he created which would serve as the backdrop for most of his best-known works. Inspired by the landscape and legends of the area he grew up in, and where his family had lived for generations, his fictional county allowed him to explore the rich history and complex culture of the South and create authentic characters. Being in Oxford insulated Faulkner from the petty rivalries and point-scoring of literary centres, and allowed him to immerse himself in the small-town remoteness of rural Mississippi, where he was completely at home and able to put all his energy into writing and radical technical experimentation, whilst also trying to earn some money by selling refreshments at a golf course and painting houses. He spent a year completing the novel and believed it to be his best yet, so he was completely devastated when his publisher sent it back saying it was too diffuse and non-integral, with neither very much plot development nor character development, and a recommendation that he shouldn't bother submitting it elsewhere, as no amount of revision would salvage it. However, Faulkner still believed that this was the book that was going to make his name, and for several months he tried editing it down himself, and sent a reduced typescript to Ben Wasson, his Ole Miss friend and agent in New York. Wasson tried 11 different publishers, all of whom said no, before Harcourt, Brace & Company agreed, providing someone, other than Faulkner, performed the extensive further cutting they felt was needed. Wasson agreed to pare down the novel, and Faulkner left for New York immediately, with the idea of joining him in the task. But when he sat down in Wasson's apartment and saw whole chunks of his novel being discarded, he couldn't be part of it, feeling he would die if there were any more cuts. Wasson persisted, however, persuading Faulkner that the trouble with the book was that it was not one novel, but 6, all struggling along simultaneously. The cut-down version was published with a new name, Sartoris, and was different to other works on offer at the time as it focused on the Civil War and its legacy rather than the First World War, introducing themes of Southern decay and the burdens of honour and history that would define much of his subsequent work. Once again, reviews were mixed. There was praise for his writing style, but criticism of the book's loose plot and lack of consistency, and again it did not sell well. Faulkner never gave up on his original conception, however, and in 1973, 11 years after his death, a restored version based on his original manuscript, putting back the 40,000 words that had been cut out, was published. While Wasson was wielding his surgical knife, Faulkner began working on a new book. Convinced now that he was never going to become a successful novelist, he decided to write something that he wanted, with no concessions to the cautious commercialism of the world of publishing. The Sound and the Fury. In successive stream-of-consciousness monologues, the three brothers of Caddy Compson reveal their differing obsessions with their sister. It's a dark book, very dark in places, and not easy to read. But when it was finished, he insisted that Wasson not do any editing or add any punctuation. It is his first work in which he finds his mature voice, demonstrating his mastery of innovative storytelling techniques. But yet again it had mixed reviews and mediocre sales on release, not helped by being published just before the Wall Street crash. If 1929 was a year of artistic growth, it was also a momentous year in his personal life. His old flame Estelle Oldham was back in Oxford with her 2 children, but without her husband. Although she had dutifully followed him to Hawaii and then to China, it was not a happy marriage for Estelle. Both she and Franklin drank heavily, and both gambled. Cornell at cards and Estelle at high-stakes mahjong. After being separated for some time, the divorce was finalised in April 1929. And 2 months later, Faulkner was able to marry the woman he had always wanted. Faulkner fans are often less than enthusiastic about his wife and her impact on his life. She drank, later attending Alcoholics Anonymous. She spent money like water, and she had no respect for his work, seeing it as more of a hobby, like collecting stamps. Several of his biographers have puzzled over his decision to marry her, one saying that Faulkner must have been aware that he was stepping into a doomed relationship, but he was simply unable to stop himself. Later in life, Faulkner himself said that his decision to marry Estelle had been prompted by a sense of guilt and duty, and claimed he had got her pregnant while she was still married to Franklin, and had then helped her get rid of it. But nobody knows if this is true or just another of his stories, an embellished half-truth or a complete fabrication. But there is no doubt that it was not an easy relationship. On their honeymoon in Pascagoula, after a night of heavy drinking, Estelle, dressed in a silk gown, walked across the beach and into the sea, and carried on walking. Her new husband watched and shouted, "She's going to drown herself," and one of the dinner guests sprinted into the water, catching her just before she got to the deeper channel, and dragged her back, struggling onto the sand. What her intentions were, we don't know. But one time, while she was still married to her first husband, she had turned up in Oxford with bandages on both wrists. While still waiting for The Sound and the Fury to appear on the shelves and working nights at the university power plant, Faulkner began As I Lay Dying, a darkly humorous tale of a poor white family as it makes its slow and convoluted way to Jefferson to bury the rapidly decaying body of its matriarch. Narrated by members of the family and the various people they meet on their journey, it is the most multi-voiced of his novels, and its experimental style further established him as a literary innovator. It was written in just 6 weeks, from midnight to 4 a.m, after he had shovelled coal for the first 8 hours of his shift, and he allowed no editing or revision. Aware of its complexity and his previous modest sales, his publisher gave it a cautious initial print run of just 750 copies. As a married man with 2 stepchildren and conscious he was earning little from his novels, Faulkner began producing short stories for national magazines, starting with A Rose for Emily in 1930. 20 stories appeared over the next 2 years, earning him up to $1,000 apiece, making him enough to buy a once grand plantation house to show everyone he'd made it. He renamed it Roanoke after the rowan tree of Scotland, symbolising peace and security, and the oak representing strength and solitude. But it was in a pretty ramshackle condition when he moved in, having been unoccupied for 7 years, with no plumbing or electricity, a leaky roof and rotten beams. Undaunted, Faulkner set about restoring it himself to something like its former glory, and he kept horses on his 4-acre plot for riding and hunting, like the proper southern gentleman he aspired to be. But living like a gentleman is not cheap, so the production line of short stories for magazines had to keep rolling, and he decided to write a book purely to make money, Sanctuary. A dark and controversial story about the violent consequences of the abduction and brutal assault of an upper-class Mississippi college girl during the Prohibition era. The first draft was completed in 3 weeks, but he had to tone it down when the publisher expressed doubts about whether it could be legally published in the US. As soon as it appeared in 1931, it was a bestseller, for all the wrong reasons, according to some, as readers looked for lurid titillation. But he had finally produced a book that sold, more copies in just 3 weeks than his previous 2 combined. And the notoriety led to greater sales of his other works as well, and finally gave him some financial security. It didn't go down too well in conservative Oxford, however, many agreeing with the reviewer who described it as a devastating, inhumane monstrosity of a book. Perfect for Hollywood, it was immediately adapted into the story of Temple Drake, earning Faulkner $6,000, and although it was considerably toned down from the novel, concerns about its subject matter played a large part in the Hays Code crackdown on anything morally ambiguous. Faulkner's first daughter, Alabama, was born 2 months prematurely in January 1931 and survived for only 9 days. Estelle was not consulted about the funeral arrangements, and she did not attend the burial. A few months later, still anemic and physically frail, she joined her husband in New York, where he was working on Light in August. But neither had emotionally recovered from their loss. Faulkner was drinking heavily, and Estelle, after a shopping excursion, became hysterical in her hotel room, tore at her dress, and tried to jump out of a window. The following year, Faulkner got an offer from MGM to come to Hollywood as a screenwriter. He wasn't that keen, but it was around the time he heard that his publisher had gone bust, and the $4,000 he was expecting from the sales of Sanctuary was not going to materialise. Somehow, word got round Oxford that he was broke, and when he tried writing a cheque for $3 in a store, the owner told him he'd rather have cash. Hollywood suddenly became more attractive, but he was so strapped he didn't even have the money to send a telegram to say yes. And eventually MGM sent him in advance to pay for his train ticket to Los Angeles. He admitted later that he was scared by all the hullabaloo on his arrival, and when he was taken into a projection room to see a picture and assured the job was going to be easy, he got flustered and ran off to Death Valley to hide, as it was the quietest place he could think of. After 9 days of deep breathing, he returned to the studio, ready to earn his $500 a week. The stress of trying to complete his 500-page manuscript of Light in August before his departure also contributed to this mini breakdown. Not helped when Estelle, angry for some reason, threw it out the car window, sending her husband into the roadside ditches to retrieve it. Faulkner impressed his Hollywood bosses by completing 4 story treatments in 4 weeks, and a meeting with up-and-coming director Howard Hawks was arranged. Over a couple of quarts of whiskey, as Hawks recalled later, they got on well, and he immediately bought the rights to a Faulkner short story, Turnabout, and asked him to adapt it into a script. Within 5 days, the first draft was ready. Hawks felt it was one of the finest scripts he'd ever read, but Metro's head of production, Owen Thalberg, insisted on a rewrite to include some love interest and their contracted star Joan Crawford, much to Faulkner's annoyance. The result was Today We Live, very different from Faulkner's original conception and rather too long for audiences, so it made a slight loss. Faulkner tried to stick to his old habits in California by dressing in tweeds and going pig hunting on Santa Cruz Island. Back home in Mississippi, he didn't have to impress anybody, and he returned to the things he loved: hunting, horses, and dogs. He didn't really like talking about literature at all, and the film world even less. Estelle's history of difficult deliveries and ongoing anemia was a concern to her doctor, John Cully. But despite her frailty, she had a healthy daughter, Jill, in 1933, and Mammy Kelly was still around to help look after her. The new parents were ecstatic, but it was the end of their physical relationship. They moved into separate rooms and their marriage became increasingly loveless. Their daughter later said, "I don't think of them as a happy couple, but they were happier with each other than they would have been with anybody else." But Faulkner did look elsewhere, and in December 1935, when he was back in Hollywood, he met Howard Hawks' 28-year-old secretary, Meta Carpenter. A divorcee from Mississippi, she was initially reluctant to begin an affair with a married man, so they would just go for dinner at Musso Frank's, the writers' hangout on Hollywood Boulevard. But gradually, according to Carpenter, they just sort of grew into each other. Considered a cold, emotionless man by most who knew him in Hollywood, Faulkner revealed his inner passions to Meta, writing her tender love poems, some of which are so tender they have to remain sealed until 2039 at the New York Public Library. And on a weekend away together, he spread gardenia and jasmine petals over the bed. Their other dates were more modest, as he was sending most of his Hollywood earnings back home. Ping-pong in the games room of her apartment building, crazy golf and weekend walks on the beach, fueled by hot dogs and soda. Meta wanted to marry him, but despite being the happiest he had ever been with anyone, and telling her that she'd saved his life by keeping him sane and alive, he just couldn't bring himself to leave Estelle. Somehow, he managed to juggle the demands of his film work, short story writing and complicated personal life to produce a volume of poems. But the stress of it all made him drink more, and he ended up needing a detox at the Gartley-Ramsey Hospital in Memphis, which advertised itself as using Dr. John Kellogg's famous Battle Creek sanitarium methods. Fresh air, vigorous exercise, lots of whole foods, and frequent enemas. With the money flowing in from Hollywood, Faulkner was able to take up one of his boyhood passions, flying. He bought a Waco cabin aircraft and regularly flew it, gathering material for Pylon, one of his few novels not set in Mississippi. The story of a group of barnstorming pilots living unconventional hand-to-mouth lives with unorthodox and, for the time, rather shocking relationships. It was well received on release, but is now regarded as one of his weaker novels. Faulkner gave the plane to his youngest brother, Dean, and encouraged him to become a professional pilot. And he used to take passengers up for $1 a ride. But at an Armistice Day pageant in 1935, he went up with 3 cousins. Something went wrong and they crashed, killing all 4, and leaving a widow who was 4 months pregnant. Grieving and feeling guilty, Faulkner, head of the family since his father's death 3 years previously, took it upon himself to support them, along with his mother, wife, stepchildren, and his own daughter. Although he took his role seriously, he found it a burden, and later lamented that he was the oldest son to widowed mothers and inept brothers and nephews and wives and other female connections and their children, most of whom I don't like, and with none of whom I have anything in common. It has been suggested that the death of his brother may have contributed to the emotional intensity of his next novel, Absalom, Absalom, the tragic history of a southern plantation family, another technically complex work with an out-of-order, not always reliable narration, which allows Faulkner to show how truth varies with the teller of the story. The book cemented his reputation as one of the most important voices in American literature, although many readers struggled with its postmodern style. In 1936, he returned to Hollywood, this time with his wife and family, and now earning $1,000 a week. He and Estelle socialized with the Hollywood set and invited some of the biggest stars for dinner. Estelle loved the lifestyle, but he was less enthusiastic, and his letters to friends reflect his frustrations over wasting his time and having his talent corrupted. He continued his affair with Carpenter, and one time invited her to his house to meet Estelle, pretending she was his agent's girlfriend. Estelle was not fooled, however, and although she was polite enough at the time, sparks flew the next day. He worked on some major films during this period, sometimes being credited with a screenplay, but sometimes being called in to rescue productions that weren't quite going according to plan. Frustrated that he was never going to leave Estelle, Meta married another man in 1937. Faulkner reacted to the news by drinking himself into such a stupor that he gave himself third-degree burns on a steam pipe in his hotel room. The Wild Palms was published in 1939. 2 interlocking stories, the first about a young doctor escaping into the wilderness with a married woman, who is imprisoned when his lover dies after he performs an illegal abortion. The second about a convict who risks his chance of freedom to rescue a pregnant woman. Highly emotive subjects for the time, and still emotive today. He followed this up with The Hamlet in 1940, the first of his trilogy about the Snopes family. When America entered the Second World War, Faulkner attempted to enlist in the US Air Force, but at 45 he was rejected because of his age, and he spent most of the war years in Hollywood, contributing to some important movies, including an adaptation of Ernest Hemingway's To Have and Have Not. In 1942 he published Go Down, Moses, originally a collection of 7 related stories, which Faulkner later considered a novel. For a while, Estelle and 11-year-old Jill joined him in California. They rented an apartment around the corner from the Chinese theatre, played mini-golf, went to the beach, and Jill took riding lessons at the same riding school as Elizabeth Taylor. But Faulkner's relationship with his wife did not improve, and one time someone asked him how he got an injury on his forehead, and he explained, "I was just sitting there reading Time magazine when Estelle came at me with a croquet mallet." And at summer's end, ostensibly for Jill's schooling, mother and daughter were dispatched back to Oxford by train. By 1945, Faulkner was entirely dependent on his screenwriting and short stories. Only one of his 17 novels, Sanctuary, was still in print, and although his genius was recognised abroad, Jean-Paul Sartre describing him as a god, in America he remained relatively obscure as a novelist. But his alcohol abuse was out of control, and when his daughter pleaded with him to think of her and stop drinking, he simply replied, "Nobody remembers Shakespeare's children." Things changed, however, at least on the literary front, when Malcolm Cowley, a prominent critic and editor at the New Republic, proposed that they work on an anthology of his writing, with excerpts from his novels, explanatory information about his fictional Yoknapatawpha County, and some of his short fiction. The portable Faulkner was released in 1946, received glowing reviews, and introduced many Americans to his unique style of storytelling. His next novel, Intruder in the Dust, revolves around a black farmer accused of murdering a white man, and is Faulkner's response to the deep-rooted racial problems of the South. Using a stream-of-consciousness narration with lengthy passages of Southern folk memories of the Civil War, it is a book, like so much of his work, that remains very relevant today. In 1949, Faulkner was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature for his powerful and artistically unique contribution to the modern American novel. The 4th American to be so honoured, after Sinclair Lewis in 1930, Eugene O'Neill in 1936, and Pearl Buck in 1938. In his acceptance speech, he emphasised the duty of writers to confront universal truths and the enduring power of the human spirit with its capacity for compassion and sacrifice. The award marked a turning point in his life, bringing him fame and renewed interest in his earlier works. It also meant people wanted to know more about Faulkner the man, something he was not at all keen on revealing. At around the same time, he met another young woman, Joan Williams. He was 52. She was a 20-year-old Bard College student and aspiring writer. He was immediately attracted and spent the next 3 years trying to charm her. In 1951, he returned to Hollywood, and as a Nobel laureate, he was now able to command $2,000 a week. In the California Sun, he resumed his affair with Meta Carpenter, as she had separated from her husband, but it wasn't the same. He then travelled to England and France. Although the quality of his writing is sometimes said to have declined after he was awarded the Nobel Prize, he certainly didn't dry up, producing Requiem for a Nun, a sequel to Sanctuary in 1951. There was further travelling in 1952 to France, England and Norway, and he continued his pursuit of Joan Williams. In her memoirs, she said she was simply seeking writing advice from Faulkner, not a romantic liaison, but the two met frequently, and eventually one thing led to another. He thought about leaving Estelle, and Estelle thought about leaving him several times, but they stayed together as man and wife, legally, if not emotionally, and the strain of it all contributed to his drinking problem getting worse. At one point in 1952, his editor said that he was witnessing the complete disintegration of a man after he drank himself to the point of delirium and incontinence. Deeply depressed when Williams ended their affair, he underwent a series of 6 electroshock therapy sessions at New York's West Hill Sanitarium, and he was hospitalized again to dry him out the following year. Whatever your thoughts about shock treatment today, there were really no effective alternatives in November 1952, as imipramine, the first antidepressant, was still being trialled. The Nobel Prize may have had a positive impact on Faulkner's earnings, but it also had an impact on his privacy, and he was never someone who was comfortable in the spotlight or talking about his work. He is even said to have turned down an invitation for dinner at the White House, claiming that it was too far to go just to eat with strangers. In 1953, he completed A Fable, a long, densely written novel about the First World War, which he dedicated to his daughter. He also resumed his screenwriting relationship with Howard Hawks, joining him in Paris and St-Moritz in Switzerland to work on his latest film, and where he began an affair with Jean Stein, a 19-year-old writer who had interviewed him for the Paris Review. In 1954, his daughter was married, and Faulkner was asked by the US State Department to take on goodwill ambassadorial duties, which led to trips to Japan and Latin America over the next few years. He also became politically active at home, taking a stance on racial issues in the hope of helping those with entrenched positions find some common ground, but succeeding only in alienating all sides. In 1955, he was awarded the National Book Award for Fable, and in his acceptance speech he emphasised his belief in the importance of individual freedom and responsibility and what he saw as the evils of welfare programs. In 1957 and 58, he accepted semester-long appointments as writer-in-residence at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, where his daughter had settled with her children and where he would join her horse riding and fox hunting. He enjoyed his teaching role, but cautioned against attempts to overanalyze his work. When a student asked whether Jewel, in As I Lay Dying, purchased the horse as a substitute for his mother, Faulkner replied, "Well now, that's something for the psychologist. He bought the horse because he wanted that horse." He completed his Snopes trilogy with The Town in 1957 and The Mansion in 1959, bringing the family saga to beyond the end of the Second World War. But it was around this time that he started having a number of falls from his horse, which exacerbated his back problems, which made him drink more, which led to a hospital admission where he was diagnosed with acute on chronic alcoholism. Reluctantly, he agreed to see a psychiatrist, but he was so outraged at the bill for $450 that he decided to stick with an ordinary doctor. He was prescribed Seconal, a barbiturate that was widely used at the time to help with sleep problems, but which is highly addictive and unsafe when mixed with alcohol, as Marilyn Monroe, Judy Garland and Jimi Hendrix, amongst others, would later find out. And his pride and joy, Roanoke, began to be a bit neglected, as drinking was a bigger priority for both Faulkner and his wife. His editor, Sax Cummins, describing it as a rambling southern mansion deteriorated like its owner. The rooms are bare, and what they do contain is rickety, tasteless, ordinary. In 1961, he began his final novel, The Reivers, a genial, nostalgic, coming-of-age comedy which portrays the adventures of a young boy and his companions who steal a car to visit a Memphis bordello. It was published the following year and was well received, winning the Pulitzer Prize. But on the 17th of June 1962, he injured his back again when he fell off his horse at Roanoke. He was bedridden and took large doses of alcohol, painkillers and tranquilizers to combat the pain, but he became confused and incoherent. On the 6th of July, he was taken to Wright Sanatorium, where he had spent time recovering from past alcoholic episodes. But 8 hours later, he had a heart attack and died. His health undermined by a lifetime of drinking and by too many falls from horses that were too big for him. He was 64. I started this journey into the life of William Faulkner wanting to find out why a man who achieved so much was so troubled and so reliant on alcohol. In life he was quiet, shunned publicity and disliked talking about himself and his writing, and to some extent he remains an elusive character. There are several very good biographies that document the facts of his life, but the motivations, the whys and wherefores of his writing and of his personal story are less obvious. There is no doubt he was a great writer. His novels are consistently ranked among the greatest works of world literature. There is also no doubt that he had a serious alcohol problem for most of his life. From teenage experimentation and hanging around with the town drunk, his drinking rapidly got out of control, and by the time he went to New York in his early 20s, he was drinking to the point of passing out most days. He is certainly not alone amongst American writers in having a drink problem. His almost exact contemporary Ernest Hemingway was also a monumental binge drinker, along with John Steinbeck, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Tennessee Williams. And growing up, it must have seemed that alcoholism was inevitable. Pretty much everyone in his family had an unhealthy relationship with the bottle. His great-grandfather, the old colonel, was a well-known drinker, and many of the family legends about his exploits involved a bit of booze-fueled bravado. His grandfather, father, and all three of his brothers also had issues, and they would periodically check into a sanatorium for treatment. His father, Murray, was a mean drunk who harboured a lifelong resentment at his own father's decision to sell the family railroad. The centrepiece of his life and cornerstone of his self-respect. When he tried to save it by raising finance to buy it himself, the bankers just laughed. And the overwhelming sense of being a failure that this engendered never left him, vividly recreated by his son in The Sound and the Fury. Family history looms large in Faulkner's life and writing. How could it not when a 30-foot-high statue of his illustrious forebear dominates the town cemetery? And it seems to me that consciously or unconsciously, Faulkner was always trying to restore the family's name and prestige. He was determined to marry his slightly better off and more established Southern Belle neighbour. He bought a plantation-style house, even though it was a wreck and his finances were far from stable, and he was determined to stay with his wife despite all of their problems, their incessant drinking, and his affairs. And this desire, this need for positive regard is presumably why he pretended to have been wounded on active service as a pilot ace in the First World War. A fiction he maintained for years, more likely to increase his standing in the community than the truth of him never having got off the ground. His father was known for his long silences, and like his father, Faulkner too would remain stubbornly silent for unnerving periods of time, driving the more outgoing Estelle to distraction. In his hometown of Oxford, people thought him a little strange, aloof. Some thought him snobbish. At times he would pass people in the street, people he knew well, but not notice them, or not want to notice them, preferring to stare into space. His brother John called him a tender man with a shell around him to protect his feelings. He also used alcohol as a way of shutting out the world. There was never a time when Faulkner didn't drink, but the loss of his daughter Alabama, born prematurely, possibly as a result of Estelle's drinking during the pregnancy, and the death of his brother Dean, his kid brother he had introduced to flying. Both of these losses hit him hard and gave him nightmares for years afterwards. In his writing, Faulkner didn't shy away from the evils of drink and dysfunctional families, nor did he shy away from the social problems of the day. And I think this is why his work remains so powerful, because none of these problems have gone away. In the 21st century, there have been objections to his portrayals of women, black Americans, and people with disabilities, But he was a man of his time, and he reflected the full range of opinions through the contrasting voices in his novels. His portrayal of Benji, the autistic brother of Caddy in The Sound and the Fury, has been criticised for emphasising his animal-like otherness. But by highlighting his forced castration at an asylum, Faulkner raised the important issue of compulsory sterilisation of the mentally ill and intellectually disabled, the legality of which had recently been upheld in the US Supreme Court Buck v. Bell ruling of 1927. A ruling which led to sterilisation rates more than doubling to 20,000 a year by 1935. So Faulkner was simply reflecting what was going on in America and many other countries around the world. One of the most characteristic aspects of Faulkner's writing is his innovative style. And if I'm honest, I didn't really like it very much when I was younger, as it felt a bit too much like hard work. That changed as I learned more about the world, and I feel the postmodern techniques he uses of allowing multiple, overlapping, contrasting, inconsistent and unreliable voices is a more honest way of portraying the world and its problems than a single dogmatic narrative. And I think it is these alternative voices that still lead to people trying to ban his work, such as the schools in Kentucky who objected to his references to masturbation and abortion in As I Lay Dying. And I think it is because the issues he chose to address in his writing are still issues that divide opinions today, that people are still reading and will continue to read and to interpret the novels of the quiet, introspective, high school dropout, William Faulkner. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this one. As always, I'd love to hear your views on anything that came up in the video. There aren't many shortcuts into Faulkner's world, I'm afraid. His complex novels are almost impossible to film, but James Franco's The Sound and the Fury is probably the best of the modern attempts. And The Reivers with Steve McQueen is still a great romp. As you'd expect for such a major figure, there are lots of biographies exploring every aspect of his life and work in minute detail. Joseph Bolotner's 800-pager is the most detailed, but I like this one by Richard Gray, and also use Jay Perini's. I'll add them to my Amazon store page if you're interested. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.